Okay, welcome everybody to our last session of Startups and Advisors. We are really excited to be here again today. This is our third session. We've had two fantastic sessions with Doug. We do have the recordings of the previous sessions right on our website, so you can check it out. First session, part one, was how to choose an advisor as you're starting up. And then the second session was about advisors, how to choose a startup. And we'll get some really valuable information and opinions and sort of guidance from our panel today. So we're excited about that. Again, I want to encourage you, please use the chat to ask any questions, any things that come up as we go. Doug will be moderating this and we'll be asking some specific questions as well, but we do want you to be interactive. Please keep yourselves on mute, and also if you can, please share your camera. Again, this is the third session we have. We are going to be continuing some version of this program as we go in the fall as well, but thank you guys very much for joining us. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Doug. Most of you know him very well, again, from our previous two sessions. Doug is an executive resident here at LISH, and he's been with us a few years. Really helping us navigate through both AI in the enterprise and the role of startups and how to think about entrepreneurial activities. Doug, welcome back.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jen, and welcome everybody. Today is the culmination of the Startups and Advisors series. We are going to have a very distinguished panel who will offer their experience and their opinions around startups and advisors. The previous two sessions have dealt with startups and advisors from two different points of view. The first session was how advisors would engage around or engage startups, and in that capacity, we took a startup point of view, taking the CEO's point of view as well as the board's, the executive officer's point of view, and explored how the advisor would engage. And then in the second session, we turned the table and we took the advisory services from the advisor's point of view and explored the process involved in engaging and even the compensation involved. So at this session, we've assembled a very distinguished panel of people who have had a lot of experience as CEOs who have interacted with advisors, as well as people who have functioned as an advisor in the startup domain, as well as the public company domain. So what I'd like to do in the next 5 minutes is introduce our panel very quickly, and then we will jump into a couple of slides which explain, which kind of summarizes the advisory situation in startups. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Adrian Mendoza. And Adrian is a fintech investor at Mendoza Ventures. He is the founder of Mendoza Ventures, the first Latinx VC fund on the East Coast. Mendoza Ventures has invested in Finch, for example, and Listo, and Rise, and Fiverity. And he has a degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I'd like to introduce Brittany Greenfield, who is the founder and CEO of Wabi. Wabi is a SecDevOps process automation platform that assimilates application security processes and tools into existing development workflows. Formerly worked at Cisco, HubSpot, and Kronos. She has an MBA from MIT Sloan. David Flaschen is a very rich guy. He's been in the Boston area for many years. He spent 10 years at Dun & Bradstreet, was president at AC Nielsen, chairman and CEO of Donley Marketing, president and CEO of Thompson Financial, managing director at Flagship Ventures, and partner at Castanilla Partners. You may also know that he is a former professional soccer player. The Chicago Sting selected David in the first round of the 1977 North American Soccer League draft. He played 2 seasons with the Sting, and he has an MBA from Wharton. Mark Sievewright is having 30 years of financial services experience and is a founder and CEO of Sievewright Associates. He has held senior leadership positions at HSBC, MasterCard Payment Systems, Tower Group, and Fiserv, where he served as president of the Credit Union Solutions Division. He is an advisor to Fiverity. And lastly, but not finally, Matt Provo. He is a founder and CEO of Stormforge. He is, which was formerly Carbon Relay, which is an Insight Venture Partners investor. He's a serial entrepreneur and product manager with 10 years of experience, including companies like Parked In. He worked for Apple for a long time, and he also works with Invisible Children, which is an NGO. He has an MBA from HBS, and our distinguished panel. So we have put together this large part because there are a lot of mistakes that it make as startups in utilizing advisors. The audience that today, as well as the last two times, have been CEOs and advisors and angel investors and business school students, as well as people from the startup community. And so what we are going to dive into today is advisory challenges, and from a number of different point of view. Today, we know that advisors engage with startups on a really large range of activities, strategic advice as well as practical advice. They engage around getting the annual op plan, which is a activity that occurs in December and January of every year, especially among venture startups. Sometimes advisors come in very specific ways around compensation or employee morale. And so there's this wide variety of subjects where advisors engage. But there's also a wide variety of stages where advisors engage. Some advisors start at a zero stage, which you'll see at the bottom of this slide, where there are product-related challenges such as the MVP or the MEP. And then advisors often engage in the next stage, where there's a founder's transition or a lead investor is an important objective to obtain. In Series A, more often than not, the challenge is to reach ARR of 1 in order to entice VCs at the minimum. And it's Series B, C, D, and afterwards, you have all kinds of different challenges where advisors get involved, such as customer expansion, scaling MRR as well as ARR, and then subsequently, before either IPO or exit, there's international expansion and profitability. So either by subject or by stage, advisors have these large-scale challenges which they encounter. I'd like to ask Brittany, when does a company need an advisor, in your opinion?
When doesn't it? More seriously, you know, Doug just outlined different situations when you might engage an advisor. And as a founder, you spend a lot of time thinking alone by yourself or with your co-founders. And, you know, I think the right time to think about, first, you can't do this alone. Getting outside opinions is helpful wherever you are in your journey. But there's a time to start to formalize that. And when you start to formalize that, I would say, is once you have a strong thesis about what you're going to do, what your strategy is, and what your product is, because it's not useful to have an advisor if they can't provide advice. And once you've really solidified what you need and what kind of advisor you need and what your product's going to be like, we all know that's going to change as well, then you can go start building that board of advisors and make sure you're picking the right person, whether it's helping you tackle go-to-market strategy, just more general product advice or scaling advice. But if you assemble that board beforehand, and not that you won't end up with some people that fall off, over time as you mature, but you need to have a real purpose for that advisor. Otherwise, it's a waste of both of your time.
Very good. Mark, how do you view your superpowers as an advisor?
Oh, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Doug. Doug, I would say my British accent, but that's facetious, so I'll move on from that. I think the superpowers for me revolve around an acronym I've used for a number of years, Doug. KEEN, K-E-E-N. Knowledge, experience, expertise, and network. What I found is that obviously advisory boards are used to fill gaps in expertise, gaps in experience. And what I've learned through the 3 fintechs I'm involved with, Doug, including Fiverity, as you mentioned, is that the expertise, experience, and network effects that I can bring to the table are actually very valuable for an early stage organization that perhaps cannot afford yet to recruit full-time all of the expertise and experience they need. And then, of course, as your chart here indicates, the customer expansion phase is critical from a networking perspective. So access into, for example, the financial services industry, Doug, where I've spent, as you said very kindly, most of my career, is very valuable for the fintechs that I happen to work with. So I'll sum it up by saying my KEEN acronym.
Very good. That's cool, that KEEN acronym. So I'd like to ask David, who serves currently on several public boards, to address the issue of how do you compare interacting with an advisor, either as the board member or as an advisor who interacts with board members. Which one do you prefer, and how do you view the roles? Nina, could you take them off?
Sorry. My number one objective in working with a company is to help management achieve. And in order to have influence, you have to build a trust bond with the CEO and the management team. And I have found it much easier as an advisor to create that trust bond as a foundation for having influence. Boards are often ripe with conflict of interest. They get bogged down by fiduciary responsibility. And I like to focus my time and attention on management CEO without those burdens.
Okay, very interesting. Adrian, as the active VC in the group, how would you characterize your engagements or your activities around advisors and startups?
I've got an interesting perspective because I've been a founder before, as well as an advisor and now investor. And usually for us, I love this chart that you've put together, Doug, because one of the things this highlights is that advisors that you have in the beginning stages aren't necessarily the advisors that you have in the later stages. And one of the things in the early, from the 0 to C to the A, is these advisors are going to not only act as helpful sort of stepping stone to the company, but also are going to be investor references for you. And so when we look at an early company, one of the things that's, one of the big issues I see with early stage companies is they go and get these big names. And then we look at the deck and we'll just walk through the deck from the advisors and say, is this person an investor or is this person a customer? And 99.9% of the time, the answer is no to both. And then we look at the slide and say, why are they here? Really, they have to, in the early stage, be believers of you and also have to be the right fit for the right stage. I mean, Doug, you've heard this story from me before. We've looked at a startup that was in the payment space, and none of the advisors were in the payment space. And we were like, wait a minute, you're disrupting a space. you usually want to fill these roles with individuals that are able to give you domain expertise very early on, from both funding to customers. And that's why we push on them at the early stage. Are they a customer? Are they an investor? And then as you go on, you then bring in the Marks and the Davids that are really there to help you with very tactical, strategic goals as the company goes from a different stage, from roadblock to roadblock to different milestone.
Just a brief follow-on question. Is there a place in startup companies for rock star advisors, people who have a halo around them?
For us, it's how active are they? I don't want to make it the Doug show, but Doug, Doug is one of these individuals who's very, very active with companies, not just your traditional advisor. And so what we'll do is we'll reach out to that advisor and have the conversation. Like, for me, most advisors, if you're lucky, this happened to me, will buy you a cup of coffee every other month. But I'm looking for that active advisor who on a weekly basis is engaging with the CEO, is able to help them, is able to get them to grow. And that's what we see a huge merit. If that rock star is just believing in that CEO, believing in that founder, and giving them a lot of the time, that means a lot for investors.
Okay. Well, then we'll consider Mick Jagger next time in one of the companies we bring you, Adrian. Okay, so let's consider the topic of advisors and CEOs. What advisors look for in CEOs are vision, integrity, the ability to execute, effective delegator, and administrative skills. In addition, CEOs are meant to be resource providers, passionate, amiable, excellent communicator, and unconcerned about popularity, as well as being highly adaptive. Matt, how have advisors impacted your performance as a CEO?
Well, number one, that's kind of an intimidating slide. No matter how much experience you have, and I think we should just acknowledge that, and that's okay. The role itself, I think, also changes, adapts, develops, and new requirements within these categories largely present themselves, or some may say rear their heads in different ways. And I think that from an advisor standpoint, I've always wanted to bring people under the tent with me that could help, number one, the job not feel quite as lonely from time to time. Number two, give advice and direction with consistency, but also with clarity. Also creating a kind of a safe space for me to be open, honest, transparent, and to be able to listen. Advisors for me across my career and specifically the last 5 years with Stormforge have helped me see around corners, helped me anticipate things that I might not have seen, helped me see where my weak spots were, and be able to give feedback. And so I think it's important that we let pride down and try to operate within these within these areas, but that we give advisors enough context to be dangerous and helpful, but at the same time, there's been power for me to have advisors that have enough context and relationship with me, but don't have the emotional day in, day out connection with the business, because it is uniquely different obviously to being the CEO or being the founder that's in it day in and day out.
That was a great answer. I have to say that I lifted this slide from one of our previous sessions, and I should have offered a little bit more context. I'm sorry, I should have added that, but maybe David could jump into this and offer to elaborate on this trust bond between the advisor and CEO, as well as how can an advisor improve, I'm sorry, how can an advisor improve CEO performance? Jen, could you unmute David?
I think advising is a learned skill. Like Matt, I've worked very hard on my listening skills. The range of areas where you can be helpful is indicative in Doug's slide with all the arrows on it. You never know from one day to the next how you will be queried, as Mark says and Matt says, based on your previous experience of making lots of mistakes. I believe less is more. I think behavioral science backs me up that if you want to have influence, you really want to focus on the key areas to help management achieve. And mostly because any advice that you give that isn't implemented is ineffective. One of my favorite expressions, which Doug knows well, is, Doug, here's a thought for your consideration. When it becomes his idea, it's going to be implemented, and you have a chance to help the CEO and management achieve.
Okay. Well, you did reference the MEO slide, and here it is. It is, there are a number of different forces which exert themselves at different stages. In early stages, you see a lot of cultural forces. In subsequent phases, it's funding, inflection, scaling, and effectiveness becomes a big force in later stages. So what I'd like to do is, Jen, check in with the audience and see whether or not there are any questions.
Yeah, we got a great question here. What are the best strategies to gather advisors? What are some things, again, you as panelists have gone through? So maybe a couple of you can chime in.
Yeah, Jen, this is Mark. Speaking just directly from my experience, it's been through that network effect again. You know, people who have a certain profile in the industry or fulfilled certain roles. And although it sounds very trivial, Jen, often they are found on social networks and other networking tools. And I know that sounds so trivial, but I can certainly say that's how Greg Wolf at Fiverity found me, for example. So, you know, that's my take on it.
You know, I'll double down on that. It is through your networks for sure. And don't be, people are always going to be very helpful and offer advice and offer connections. Take time in your day. It may feel like you're going down a rabbit hole with no end. And that's how you meet a lot of great advisors and people that are passionate about your topic. Right? They need to be as passionate about it about your company as you are about it. So take those meetings. One, you never know who you might meet, but a lot of times it's not that first person, it's 2 or 3 down the road. For example, in our hiring process, we got introduced to somebody who turns out was a luminary in our industry and the head of engineering, right? He wasn't right for the fit, but man, he's a great friend and a great advisor to us.
That's great. And then maybe segue into this next question here. How can the entrepreneur, the CEO, disengage with an advisor without sort of crashing and burning all the bridges when you know that it's time to move on? Matt, maybe you can give us your perspective on that, and Adrian and David.
Sure, happy to. Number one, just not to derail as well, but I think that this topic of advisors as well is applicable to the CEO. Absolutely, it's also applicable to the professional and to the person that's in a company that's trying to grow and continue to advance their career. I just think even in my career prior to being a CEO, it was something that I tried to value and prioritize. So I would mention that. I think it's okay to be very open with the purpose of what you need at the time that you need it from an advisor. I also think that it's even more important as that trust is built and the purpose is defined, to use a kind of a slide or something like where Doug was, basically connecting advisors to different stages of the company. And I think it's just okay to be pretty explicit and open that here's where we see you, or here's where I see you being most helpful across these stages. It's not a linear path. No startup, no organization is. But I think it's okay to, if the trust is built, just going to the question around how do you exit the relationship, I think if the trust is built from the outset, the purpose is defined, and the communication is consistent and clear, you will collectively and both come to the place where you realize we've gone beyond what was originally defined, or we're coming up on that. And I think the role of the advisor may change at that time, and that's okay. I've had advisors in the company who have zoomed in and out of different roles or purpose across different stages of the company as well. So it may not be that they fully exit, but they may zoom out or change, or zoom in, or change a different thing that they're set of things that they're involved in, either for me or for the company along the way. And then last thing I would say is you formalize it. It's okay to formalize it, and you should, like with paperwork and whatever you need to do to define that. Don't leave that up for, just like you would as with a co-founder, from the outset and all of these things. You formalize that, and it's respectful in both directions to do so.
I think it's important that ambiguity is not great when it comes to these sort of things, but be explicit, but cordial, and navigate as you bring people on and off. Adrian, do you have a limit to this as well?
Yeah, I think to go with Matt's point, I think not be afraid to know, one, you want to have these advisors on a vesting schedule as you would have any other employee, as you would have any other founder. And more importantly, what I do when I'm either an advisor of the company or we're looking at advisor agreements is have an appendix that literally lists out things like what you want them exactly to do, what domains you want them to focus, the introductions to customers, introductions to investors. And I also put in how much time is associated with it, because you as having been in with this as a founder before, also have to prune the dead weight if those investors are not playing an active role. If you can't get them on the phone, if you can't get them, to text you or set a time with you on a monthly basis, really, that's what the vesting schedule is for, is to be able to realize if it doesn't work out and be very transparent with them. Because for us, when we're looking at a data room, we're looking at these agreements, we're looking at the, who's on the cap table, and we're seeing, did you give out enough, did you give out equity for someone that's not actively participating? If so, that begins to look at what the performance of the CEO looks like. And so I think it's really important for transparency, but also accountability.
Great, this is so insightful. David, could you chime in here as well?
My philosophy on being an advisor or performance coach is don't make the call, take the call. The last thing a CEO like Matt wants to deal with is me calling him up and say, how's it going? He doesn't need the fifth call of the week on that topic. If I built an effective trust bond and I'm providing advice and thoughts that are valuable, Matt's going to call me. And I measure my success on whether he calls me. If he's not calling me, it's very easy for me to understand that I'm not providing valuable advice. If he calls me and I'm not available or not responsive, I'm not providing good advice. Speaking a little out of school, I continue to provide informal guidance to our friend, Mr. Levin. And I would say, Doug, calls me probably once a week on topics that range from A to Z. And that gives me comfort that I've built a trust bond with Doug and that he values my advice.
Great, thank you. Doug, back over to you, our trustee here.
Well, I mean, David raises a very interesting issue by referencing me and our differences between advisors, mentors, coaches, and trust bonds, which are formed with friends and other people. So just in full transparency, David sat on my board of directors. He was on the first board of directors of Black Duck, and he was one of the most active board members I've seen from the VC community. Adrian shares this characteristic whereas there are many VC that just don't know that much about operational things. And as a result of knowing both strategic and operational things, I've maintained my relationship with David because I'm able to ask him all manner of questions. The challenges of the answer sometimes can be, especially if they transition from one role to the other, can be very focused. And so many of the advisors who, for example, raise Series A can't raise Series B and C, cope with other issues. Many advisors who are referred to in the industry as scribes can do a lot of different subjects, and those subjects can be sometimes completely unrelated. This is a good example of all the different subjects which an advisor can do. And so the advisors who can do with this through multiple stages as well as multiple topics are really valuable to companies, and a lot of calls from those companies. I'd like to go back to David and ask his a question about him, about his journey from being an operating officer to a executive officer to a board member, and now increasingly an advisor. So how would you characterize that journey?
Serendipity. I stumbled into the investing world having been a executive in residence for a venture capital firm. I was being recruited to be the CEO of a publicly held company, and the partnership wanted to grab me, so they made me a partner, and off I went on my venture journey. I then moved to the private equity world, again through serendipity. I was pitching some of my young companies to a like-minded PE firm, and they wanted more operating experience in their investment group, which, as you mentioned, is often lacking, Adrian being an exception. Along the way, my experience as both a venture capitalist and a private equity executive helped me form my opinions on how powerful an advisor can be. And it also helped me hone my listening skills, which I have to say, as having been the CEO of a number of companies, I wasn't very good at the beginning. So that's a little bit of my journey, Doug.
Okay, that's great. Mark, we encounter many times startups where they have a great technology idea and they have limited experience interacting with the customers. You have many years working in banks and credit unions, and you still maintain very close relationships with those banks and credit unions. How do you advise a CEO and a group of founders who have developed great technology but don't have the operational experience working with banks and credit unions, and they need flash insights into how to make that change of thinking from being a technologist to being a practical user of the technology?
Yeah, great question, Doug. I think it's in the narrative, Doug. It's in the dialogue and how you position the solution. So in other words, what I mean by that is oftentimes we'll have an entrepreneur that sees their product or solution a certain way, and that way may be very technical, whereas the end customer actually sees a business problem they're trying to solve. And they speak different languages, Doug, both sides of that fence. And so some of the work that I get involved in and others are changing the narrative so that the startup, or in my case, a fintech, begins to talk the language of the customer rather than the language of their solution. I hope that makes sense. And then in positioning the company or the brand or the solution, you position it in that context. You know, Greg Wolf does a great job at Fiverity. You know, he could give you a technical definition of the Fiverity solution, which certainly would confuse everyone from my country, Doug, you know, with the lower IQ over there in Wales. But when we translate what Greg does to the financial community, it is solving a problem called synthetic ID theft. And that's the language that everyone speaks. And so, you know, I find that transfer of narrative to be very, very useful.
Excellent. Brittany, you've recently successfully gotten an SBIR, and the way you got it was interacting with the guy who understands, a guy who used to work in the government, and he understands government language.
Yep.
SBIRs are hard to get. Could you describe your experience?
Yeah, no, and I think it's falls on nicely to both the power of having the right advisors to help connect you with people, as well as sometimes you have to be able to speak the language. For those that aren't familiar with an SBIR, they like to call themselves America's Seed Fund, and it's contracts that sort of grease the wheel for early stage companies that are technologies that are commercially available that can have applicability in a government application. Mine happens to be with the U.S. Air Force. And I'd actually tried it by myself the first time. And we didn't get rejected because we weren't speaking government language. I spoke commercial language, right? As much as I tried. And this was, you know, to continue to sing Doug's praises, I shared my strategy with Doug as one of my advisors. And this is where he was able to go out into his network and say, wait, I know a guy, I've worked with a guy that is an expert in this. And so they were able to come in and then translate what our commercial, well, you know, go to market was, our key milestones were, what our goals were for this SBIR, both in the initial phase 1 and the ongoing projects, and translate into that government speak. And when you get somebody that does that well, you know, especially as a founder, we can wax poetic about our babies, the products a lot, but you need somebody that's a little bit removed. And this is where the role of an advisor, whether it's part of your board of advisors or you're bringing somebody on for a specific challenge, really supports your strategy. And we would not have gotten the phase 1 without him. And we're about to get our phase 2, knock on wood. And literally he has somebody that comes in, and even he has an advisor that specializes in phase 2 and is translating all of our milestones in. And so that'll be about a $750,000 contract. But, you know, that's where you gotta, I forget who said it before, or founders don't, advisors don't forget to pick up the call. Founders don't forget to call and share what you're working on and what you're struggling with your advisors, because chances are, or you've brought them on your board for a reason. They know somebody that's been there and done that.
Great. Adrian, so if you look on the slide, you'll see that it scales from 0 stage to mezzanine stage. I was wondering if you could just, just share your experience with funding startups. And even though you're an early stage investor, where do you think the hardest inflection point or stage to stage growth occurs, and where an advisor can play a pivotal role in advancing a startup from stage to stage?
I think the hardest thing is that inflection point of Series A, right? Where you have the ARR 1 million right into Series B, C, and D. And part of it is, I think this was brought up about networks. Not only are you getting domain expertise, you're getting access to that network and their funding sources and who they know. And one of the things that we see fail is when you get, the early stage advisors that may be hands-on, they may be domain expertise, they may be industry experts, but they can't get you to that next stage of investor, and that's where it's really important to be able to, right at that sort of the seed 1, 2, 3, where they're helping you find a lead, where they're active opening their networks, where they're being references for you. The Series A is about, the getting to that top line 1 million revenue, but then you want to be able to get them to open the next doors. How do you get them to give you access to the Silicon Valley funds, to Toronto funds, to New York funds, especially if, let's say, you're based in Boston or you're based in New York and you're trying to get to the West Coast funds. And that's about finding strategic investors that can help you with that funding revenue, and also to get you to that next, the next customers that are not your $1 million where you may have hustled, but that $5 to $10 million mark. That's where you're going to need the Marks and the Davids to open up the kimono, to find you that speak the speak of that customer. And that's really, really hard, because this is where you really want to be very selective. And that's the most important beat, is the selection of them is going to be critical, because you don't want to really bring in that, amazing advisor that's going to open them up and then doesn't work. This is about creating that long-term relationship and then making sure that they're the right fit. Because I think there's, beating up Doug again, there's, there aren't a lot of Doug Levins out in the world that are going to be active in your role. There aren't a lot of Davids and Marks in the world. So you have to spend a lot of your time as the CEO making sure you can make the right call for that company.
Very good, Adrian. So, Mr. Provo, I had the pleasure of watching you help fund the company originally with a Chinese company that is a very distinguished, very large worldwide power, and then transition that investment over to Insight Venture Partners. I thought it was exceptionally well executed. Can you kind of share your thinking in that whole transition stage? You worked with your board and advisors to get that done. Share your experience, because it's very unique.
It was definitely unique. It goes back to the comment earlier around no startup is really a linear path. We happen to, alongside that, be going through a massive pivot as a business in the application of our core technology. And both from a geopolitical standpoint and from a strategic standpoint, the first 5 or 6 million of investment that came into the company was with no venture capital. It was a corporate strategic investor, and then 4 super angels that funded the company. And about a quarter after we took the second, we took 5 million of additional capital, the world really changed in a lot of areas. The company basically fit the exact profile that the United States government put out, talking about the dangers of an up and coming AI company based out of the United States, whose customers are, at least some of them in Asia or parts of China, whose IP would be at risk. And we basically fit that profile to a T. At the same time, as I mentioned, the application of our core technology was running into a lot of roadblocks from a go-to-market perspective, and so we were pivoting. And the challenge that we ran into was we had this behemoth on the cap table who was no longer interested at all in being a customer. And frankly, we were also not interested in having them as a customer or an investor. And so it was in that process and working with advisors and really getting guidance on how to restructure, how to really position the company for either an exit earlier than we thought, or a complete removal of the previously very strategic corporate investor from the cap table, while at the same time also taking care of all the existing shareholders. It was not. I think I was on a plane. I think in 6 months I was on a plane to China maybe 8 times, back and forth, trying to navigate all of this. And at the end of the day, trying to figure out how, my number one job is to both increase shareholder value as well as take care of existing shareholders. And so we had to create a scenario where seemingly everyone was going to be able to win, including, by the way, a bunch of employees who were going through this pivot. And I think the advice that I got along the way was, goes back to some of my earlier comments on being able to see around corners, getting guidance, getting direction. And I'll never forget, I was talking about it actually with some of the core employees yesterday. I really came down to one phone call where I had to have a phone call with the corporate strategic investor and really paint the picture as to why the return that they were going to get, in 18 months time post investment was really attractive, but that there was no interest mutually in working together into the future. And so it was very, very interesting. And then the transition to Insight has been equally interesting for a bunch of different reasons. When Insight was really pursuing us, and Adrian, you'll appreciate this comment because you'll know that it's genuine. All dollars in the United States are green, but all dollars are not equal. And the dollars were interesting from Insight. The operational support and guidance and the things that went beyond the dollars was where we were placing a bet in deciding who we were going to work with as an investor and ultimately a board member. It was in that transition that thankfully I had advisors like Doug and board members that had been with the company for 4 years at that point. And you saw this scenario of a balance of power that needed to be created between Insight coming into the board, existing board members, and sort of what that structure looked like. So, Doug, I don't know if that is helpful or what you were wanting me to discuss, but it was
great.
I will call it cap table gymnastics was sort of a part of that. And then, but at the end of the day, I think the one thing that was true, honestly, even for a behemoth organization who, by the way, accounts for 2.5% of China's total GDP, was even amidst all of that was this thread of relationships and trust. So even though I was calling the chief strategy officer to say, we're no longer interested in working with you, I've got a return for you, there was an existing relationship and a foundation of trust that kind of rang true, so that when we had that conversation, it was as smooth and easy as it could have been, considering the situation.
Great. I'd like to call on David and Adrian to answer or address this question. In very early stages, founders who oftentimes never work together, form a company, and they have they have a technology idea, they have a go-to-market idea, they've got financing, and sometimes the don't. Could you relate your experience as advisors and board members and investors, and talk about how you work with a founder's transition from especially in multi-founder situations where you have sometimes 3, sometimes 5 founders? How do you transition one out who doesn't seem to be able to scale, or how do you work those angles?
I could jump in this one. I've had experiences where I've been an advisor to companies, not anything we invested in, but things that, usually when I become an advisor, it's to a company that, will not have a conflict to the fund, will not be in fintech. And this was about 5 years ago. I had two founders that I ended up as the advisor have to help coach them because they were in different spots. There was one founder that was an investor, you know, as also a founder, and then the other one which hadn't invested dollars. And it was really kind of beginning to, like, we would end up meeting every week to be able to not just look at the company, but at their personalities. And we spent about 3 months of doing this to finally then get to the right spot of expectations and transparencies. You know, but at the same time, you know, I had another company that I advised, a female founder that was in enterprise sales, who was in the midst of fundraising, and who also at a certain point got to the point where she had to put a significant amount of money and decided not to. And so then as the advisor, I actually worked with her to begin to bring, you know, to shut the company down. And at the same time, she, because she had startup experience and enterprise experience, was getting multiple job offers. So then as the advisor, I was actually beginning to help her negotiate a comp package where she ended up getting, you know, an amazing 6-figure package, a C-level title, and a spot on the board. And that is a perfect spot of what an advisor can do. Not only act as a company, but you're acting as an advocate and a champion for that founder. And I'm still amazingly proud of what she did, because she went from that, I'm going to shut this down, to now being a, you know, a chief revenue officer, a chief, you know, really sitting on the board of a company. And it was really just an amazing transition. You know, for me, one of the hard things was that as an investor, you know, I think, Matt, you said the perfect thing. Money is green regardless, but it's really about what comes with it. And we are very active with our portfolio companies, but at the same time, and this is where outside advisors and mentors play an important part, I am also a fiduciary to my fund, so that not only do I give advice, but at a certain point, I'm also representing as an investor. And so there is a certain path where there is advice that I give, but it also has to come from me as the fiduciary to our SEC registered fund. And that's where I think the power of really amazing advisors that could be a third party that aren't your lead investor, like where we are, can come in to provide a different perspective, from whether it be personality or whether it also be that independent board member or that independent advisor to the board.
Very good, Adrian. David?
Building and growing a business is difficult. Every entrepreneur will tell you that, and dealing with multi-founder challenges is right at the top of the list of difficulty for advisors. One of the ways I like to attack it is to build a mantra that says the management team has to flex to the opportunity and challenges at hand. And by definition, the opportunities and challenge will change over time. Often the founders think, oh yeah, I got to make sure I've got the right team underneath me to be able to flex to the opportunities and challenges at hand. But what I'm really doing is trying to get them to look in the mirror regarding their value add. And if you built a trust bond, you can really work with individual founders to say, what do you do best? What do you enjoy doing most? And oftentimes they come to the conclusion that they would rather have the company working for them and their founder shares than exhausting limited resources when somebody else can do a better job addressing the opportunities and challenges going forward. It's hard to do, but if you built that trust bond and you have a good dialogue, it can be achieved.
Very good. What I'd like to do is go, Gian, any really good questions that have been served up in the last 5-10 minutes?
We got a bunch, but unfortunately we only have 5 minutes. So Doug, why don't we just keep proceeding with what you got left?
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is just go around the table, the panel, and ask each panelist to kind of provide their own perspective and recommendations to the startups in the audience, as well as the executive officers who and provide their own perspective on advisors and startups and CEOs and startups. And at this point, like when we start with Brittany and then go to Matt and then Mark.
I think my perspective is probably short and sweet. You ask the advisor to advise you. Use them. They're a very powerful resource. As founders, as leaders, I don't think it's stage specific. The more great people we have on our team and in our boat rowing forward with us, the better. So don't be afraid to call out. And I think Matt said it earlier, right? Your relationship may ebb and flow depending on where your focus is at that particular time. But a great advisor is somebody that you can pick up the phone and will always pick up, you could call and we'll always pick up, and you can tell them exactly what you're thinking. That's the person that's going to help you move the company forward. And that's regardless of whether, you're just getting off the ground or you've gone through multiple rounds, multiple transactions, you've asked this person to be part of the team. Make sure you're using them and you're paying them in equity too.
Matt.
So number one, I think it's one of the best uses of your time as a CEO is to both build and develop and maintain relationships with the advisors. Number two, I think that balance between enough context to be helpful, but without the kind of emotional day in, day out connection to the company is super important. You just really can't afford to not do this. I think I think that it is so important, along the way, to have that set of people there, in the trenches, but also alongside you. It absolutely reduces the feeling of loneliness and isolation and some of the very real things that happen in the ebb and flow of the maturity or the growth of the company. And I think the returns on that time, effort, energy far outweigh the effort. We've got 1,000 things we have to be thinking about all the time. But this is a very, very good use of your time, and the returns are significant when done the right way.
Gosh, it's hard to top what Matt and Brittany had said, Doug. I think the only thing I would add is the importance of engagement with the advisor, and go along with that, because it is a two-way street. The importance of having an appropriate incentivization model, usually, of course, through some form of equity participation, vesting, of course, as you said earlier, Doug, but otherwise, ditto to Brittany and Matt.
Great. For David and Adrian, could we switch the table and just get your advice to advisors and how they would engage with companies and with CEOs?
Doug, sorry to interrupt, because I don't want to have the last word, but I wanted to say one other thing, which is getting advisors around you and the company is not a sign of weakness. And I think we have to fight back against some of that. And those are kind of lies that, at least for me over time, have come into my head. And I've got a lot of other founders that kind of think that way. It is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's a sign of strength.
Yeah.
So,
one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was starting the company was don't be afraid to be vulnerable. And that's exactly why you have advisors. Those are the people you can be vulnerable to. And I ignored it because I suffered from exactly what Matt said. What are you talking about, right? And founding a startup is the only place that an overachiever comes to be told no 99% of the time, right? So you're going to be especially vulnerable, especially lonely. And this is why you have advisors. And if you're not vulnerable to them, you're not using them effectively.
Yeah, I want to follow up, Matt and Brittany. You are absolutely right. Even us as a venture fund have advisors, and I'm proud that Doug Levin is an advisor to us. But this has been 5 years in the making. I've known Doug when I was an entrepreneur and had a different perspective of my own entrepreneurial career. Now my career is in venture. And so to my advice to those wanting to become advisors, this isn't a short-term game. This is a long-term game. This is about building great relationships over time. Like had I known that 6 years ago, Doug would be an advisor to our own fund, would never have predicted that. But it was about matching with the right personalities that are providing that value, regardless of where you are in your career. As Matt and Brittany said, this is about strength in numbers, about network. Even us as in venture, even I know some of the best, Series B, Series C, or CEOs that IPO'd companies before, still have a group of friendly advisors around them that can help with challenges with just from personality to career choice. And I think as you're sort of beginning to, for a lot of people in the room that are CEOs now, that are looking to sort of give back and become that advisor, is look at the companies and the individuals that you gel with, and not to be like, oh, I'm going to do this right now. It's about meeting that network, growing it, and finding the right people that really fit with who you are and that style that you bring to really sort of have it be a great match.
Good. Last word, David.
Brittany hit the nail on the head. There was a point in time when having an advisor or performance coach was considered a remedial action. Thanks to the TV series Billions, entrepreneurs now understand having a performance coach is a great way to achieve entelechy, which is your potential. And indeed, over half the S&P 500 CEOs have advisors / performance coaches. Doug, to your point of how to be a good advisor, the entrepreneur has a very good idea of what they're looking for from an advisor. My rules for being an advisor is, A, can I establish rapport with the CEO and management to build that trust bond? B, do I think I have something relevant to offer based on my prior experience and domain expertise? And the third is, can I have fun? And that last one is important because ultimately, advisor has to ask yourself the question, would you do it for free? And indeed, I do pro bono work with minorities and women to help them advance their careers because I have rapport, I think I can make a difference, and I think I can have fun. And if you use those tests, I think you have a chance to create a great partnership that'll last many years with your entrepreneurs.
Very good, David. Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions. I want to thank all the participants for their questions and their participation and their eager listening. I want to point out that from the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard, we are going to have an expanded program in the fall that is in development. And so I'll be working closely with Jin and professors at the school to offer what has been tentatively called the Startup CEO Academy. We'll see how that works. And but in the meantime, thanks again, and I'll turn it over to Jin.
Great, thanks, Doug. Again, we'll have a recording of this available. Please check out our website for additional details. And we look forward to doing parts of this again as we go into it, as Doug mentioned. Thanks, everybody.